from Cornell University in Ithaca, upstate New York, on behalf of eCornell and the Emerging Markets Institute at the Cornell S.C. Johnson College of Business. Welcome to the webinar, Reinventing Global Value Chains. My name is Lourdes Casanova, and I am the Gail and Roberto Cañizares Director of the Emerging Markets Institute. The Emerging Markets Institute report is the most important academic publication of the Institute, where my co-author Ann Miru and myself highlight the latest research on emerging market multinationals. We are very grateful to the EMI research team led by Daniel Dos Anjos, Shinki Ye, Vinita Pachava, Noel Liu, Travis Tai, Charles Shah, Mihika Bajate, Julian Galarza, and many others, Mihika Bajate, and also Rabin and Andrew Lim, and also the summer interns. Last week, we learned from the contribution of the MNet at the OECD Development Center, also from the International Financial Corporation of the World Bank, Universidad de los Andes in Colombia, while this week we finished the report, the other contributions to the report, and very grateful to all the contributors. So we'll hear from John Manners-Bell from Transport Intelligence, and also from Ricardo Rosenberg from the Inter-American Development Bank, the University of Oxford in collaboration with Carnegie Mellon, and Wuhan University. And obviously, thank you to eCornell for the great partnership, Nicolas, Chris, Serena, and the team. And I forgot, sorry, Tecnológico de Monterrey, Anabela Davila is here with us. And also we belong to this emerging multinationals research network that is very much part of this endeavor. So global value chains are at the heart of growth in emerging markets, but they have experimented a number of changes due to the Russia-Ukraine war, due to the pandemic. So we have moved from efficient to resilient, to outsourcing, to nearshoring, friendshoring, ally-shoring. We have moved from attracting foreign direct investment to foreign direct investment. Politics is back into business. So to give a general panorama of global value chains, we have here with us John Manners-Bell, who wrote the introduction on transport. He's the CEO of Transport Intelligence. John, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lourdes, for that kind introduction. I'm very excited to be giving an overall introduction to the webinar this afternoon, or today, wherever you are. I think just before I get going and give my overview, I'd just like to start by saying I don't think it's possible to really overemphasize the challenges which many emerging markets have faced in the past year. We've seen a tightening post-pandemic fiscal environment in the West, which has resulted in a downturn in investment as well as constraining global export markets. We've seen Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has led to sky-high energy bills and food shortages, especially across China and Africa. And China, meanwhile, has suffered its own problems as the economy has struggled with its government's zero-tolerance approach to COVID. And as we're all well aware, this has created production bottlenecks, disruption to logistics systems, and distorted supply chains right around the world. And whilst many of these problems will be transient, in my view, I think we must avoid complacency. The previous global crisis in 2008 left many politicians in emerging markets feeling very badly let down by Western governments and corporations. Their economic and societal predicament, as you might say, trumped by domestic pressures. As a result, many have turned to China, which was, of course, willing to fill the void left by the West retreat. And the consequences of this failure in Western policy are still being felt keenly to this day. China's soft power now reaches deep into countries in the emerging world, not least into Africa and even the USA's backyard, Latin America. I'll spend a couple of minutes just fleshing out this point in more detail. Over the last few years, China has invested many billions of dollars in infrastructure projects linking it to countries in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East. By offering finance at very cheap rates, it has been able to extend its economic and, crucially, political influence. The area which the BRI covers is equivalent to 55% of the world's GDP, 70% of the global population, and gives it influence in regions where 75% of known energy reserves are located. One of the results of the BRI has been the development of what we call Sino-centric supply chains. Raw materials flow into China from resource-rich regions, whilst in return, finished goods flow back into those markets. Now that, combined with tensions over Taiwan and the calls for reshoring of production to North America and Europe, have created a very real risk that global value chains will become fractured, regionalized, or balkanized, as it's also been called. Political intervention, politicization, as Lourdes mentioned right at the outset, and growing protectionism will not only bring about diseconomies of scale and lead to higher inflation, but will also deny access to essential markets, exacerbating an already challenging environment for emerging markets. A further pillar of Chinese government policy, which will also have an impact on global value chains, has been the capture of supply chain value by increasing the domestically sourced proportion of intermediate goods. As you will all know, in the Factory Asia model, components produced across the region are typically transported to China for final assembly. This means that Chinese manufacturers lose out much of the value-adding process, the final assembly being a low-cost and commoditized undertaking, which of course is dependent on cheap labor. The Chinese government has recognized that for its industry to climb up the value chain, it has to invest in the know-how and facilities which avoid the need to import components from competitors throughout the region. A calculated, strategic, and in my view, so far successful move. There has been significant reduction of what the OECD call backward linkages, as more input components of final products are made domestically. At the same time as this, encouraged by the country's political leaders, consumers are purchasing Chinese-made rather than foreign goods in increasing volumes, which has been a significant shift in behavior from only a few years ago. These trends will result in China becoming more self-sufficient, both in intermediate goods as well as finished products. It's not all bad news for GVCs, however, as these same political tensions have created opportunities for emerging markets resulting from China plus sourcing strategies, also called optionalization, as global manufacturers look to mitigate risks, avoid US tariffs, and comply with new legislation, especially in the area of advanced technologies. Some of the main beneficiaries of these policies have been low-cost countries in Asia, such as Vietnam, and low-cost countries, according to the US International Trade Commission, saw their proportion of US manufactured imports rise almost 30% between 2018 and 2020. And this is in comparison with China, which saw its share of the market fall by around 15%. What is clear is that the supply chain environment is set to become increasingly complex, with the prospect of globalized open markets now looking remote, in my view, at least. If policymakers are not careful, emerging markets will be denied previously promised benefits as they find themselves caught in a power struggle between China and the West. Even well-meaning environmental legislation, such as the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism, risks further disaffection as emerging markets end up shouldering the cost of climate change. So in conclusion, I believe that geopolitical tensions have combined with uncertainty in financial terms to create an ever more challenging business and investment environment. The character of global value chains is changing, and this is creating both threats and opportunities for emerging markets, many of which we'll touch on throughout the rest of the webinar. I hope that my introduction has been interesting start to today's proceedings. And on that note, I have great pleasure in handing over to Ricardo Rosenberg, Senior Specialist at IDB.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you very much, Anne and Lourdes, for the invitation. I'm going to present our contribution to the Emerging Markets Annual Report, and I will focus on the part of multilatinas. Can you go ahead? Yes, first of all, what are multilatinas are? Multilatinas are Latin American firms who are expanding beyond their own national borders. That means through direct investment. That means there are transnational firms from Latin American countries. And this is a very important issue, and I will focus our contribution that was did with a survey we finished 1 month prior to the COVID-19 crisis. But we asked the firms some structural questions related what are they, how are they taking the decisions, how are facing the challenges, what do they face as opportunities. So we did a survey within 15 countries from the region, and we get answers from 112 firms. So what we can see as main results from this survey is that multilatinas at first have an intra-regional pattern of expansion. That means that more of this, the investment or more of the subsidiaries are located in the same region, in Latin America, also in Central America and Mexico, but there are a few of that firms that have subsidiaries in Asia and Europe, but not so much. And when we ask them how do they finance their investment abroad, they say 100% of the firms said with own funds, because it's difficult for us to access to private or public finance. But in the second place, they say, well, in our countries where the headquarters are, we get some finance from private and public banks that help us to expand our businesses abroad. Yes. 66% of multilatinas export through one or more subsidiaries. That means that sometimes we ask if investment abroad generates or create or not trade. In these cases, we can assure that foreign direct investment create trade. So this is an important thing. Now, on the other side, we ask them, well, what do you have into account when do you decide to invest abroad? And it's interesting because in the first answer is legal certainty. So the most important thing is we need legal certainty. After that, we need obviously skilled labor, geographical proximity, free trade agreements, specialized suppliers. But at the first, we need legal certainty. Almost 43 multilatinas surveyed carry out research and development. And this is very important for our region because it's not so important, the research and development investment in private and public sector. And the issue it's interesting is that primary sector ranks first in this area. Years ago or decades ago, we thought industrial was the innovator sector or services, but also we have a primary sector investing and innovating, and this is a very good news. Firms in multilatinas, almost 70% of their needs of goods and services are buy at a local level. And they show, the firms show a reasonable degree of satisfaction with these providers. So this is important because multilatinas help to create a network of firms that provides their subsidiaries. And there is a lot of more things, but you can read it in the survey. Last, the third of total employment of multilatinas correspond to women, but just a little proportion reach managerial positions. And this is an effect you can see not only in multilatinas, but also in many different enterprises in all the world, and it's a strong problem we have to resolve. So we think multilatinas are well positioned to generate job and investment in the region. I think it's very pretty necessary in the region. The growth of this kind of firm represents an opportunity to expand domestic investment, also because we think there is a crowding-in effect. The transnational firms impulse domestic investment also. Governments may focus on developing transparent legal frameworks, as firms ask for. And I think in order to finish, I think this is a very important contribution of these kind of firms, and not also to consolidate well the firms are operating already, but also to expand the number of operations of new firms from Latin America to the world. Thank you very much. And in the last slide, you have my email, but also the direct link to the whole survey for those who want to the analysis. Thank you very much. And now let me introduce Anabela Davila. She's a professor of management and strategy within Emerging Economics Group. Anabela, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yes. Well, my presentation here will be a summary of my contribution to the report. And I'm looking at the global pressures and employee-centered reporting practices. To begin with, large Latin American business organizations have a long history of performing a significant role in socioeconomic development. Economic history shows how business introduced social practices that built social infrastructure to provide their workers with benefits that cover their basic needs of education, health, and living standards. Next slide, please. Two main research streams seeks to explain such social practice. One is a familiar management style adopted by early entrepreneurs in the region, and two is that those entrepreneurs adopted a welfare approach to their workers, aiming to compensate for the labor market's precarious conditions. Such labor initiatives were considered a managerial innovation at their time to build good labor relations that prevail today. Early entrepreneurs held strong moral principles on how to conduct companies and the obligations of business toward their employees and community. Thus, companies face tensions when they receive pressure from international organizations that promote other premises for social practices, such as the principles of sustainable development of the United Nations, or the need to report their compliance with GRI standards. Also, when companies are part of the GVC and the parent companies exert pressures on the rest of the supply chain to adopt such international principles. Moreover, tension can also come from the local communities by not accepting universal principles of social practices or the lack of knowledge that new generations of family business managers might have about the legislations for social development in other countries. So the question is whether the Latin American multinational employee-centered welfare approach changed considering the internationalization of the companies. Therefore, the chapter analyzes 4 Latin American multinational annual or sustainable reports and explores how the company informs about their contribution to their employees' welfare. The analysis is carried out based on the cover letter of the company's presidents and CEO. The multinationals analyzed in this chapter come from Merco's corporate ranking on ESG, responsibility of large regional economies. For this study, the selected companies were from the biggest economies in the region and scored the highest among the Latin American companies in Merco's ranking. The companies are Arcor from Argentina, Grupo GBS from Brazil, Concha and Toro from Chile, Grupo Bimbo from Mexico. The chapter presents the inventory of the annual and sustainability reports analyzed. The cover letter of the company's presidents of CS summarizes the company primary practices in a specific year. Its analysis is a usual research strategy. The present analysis takes a 5-year cross-sectional approach for each company following the different versions of the GRI guidelines and standards. Before presenting the findings, it is interesting to point out a few observations. First, the inventory of the sustainable reports indicates that 3 of the 4 companies published the report on the second decade of the 21st century. One interpretation of this action could be the lack of international environmental pressures to issue such a report. The 4 companies are in the food sector. They thus might be seen as companies with low environmental risk, even though food production involves many natural resources in the transformation processes. Another interpretation might be related to the late adherence of these companies to the global sustainability movement. Even though the cover letter does not highlight the report sustainability framework, most companies follow the GRI standards. The cover letter included some things regarding employment, but in 1 year, the 4 companies' cover letters did not deal with employees-related issues. Only a few reports included suppliers to highlight the compliance with the code of ethics. The previous slide, Lourdes, please. Findings indicate 2 significant dimensions emerging in the analysis of the cover letters. First, presidents and sustainability directors address their employees' skills and knowledge about diversity, inclusion, gender equality, and ethics. Such actions were under the sustainability label because of the close association with the global human rights movements. The letters also highlighted the company's practices related to developing employees' leadership skills associated with the company's performance. Second, the letters stressed the introduction of sustainability goals in the employees' performance management systems. Although the cover letters made a few remarks regarding suppliers, they were related to making the suppliers comply with the company's code of ethics. Unfortunately, data on suppliers was minimal and challenging to connect to the suppliers' employees' welfare. The content of Arcor's statements about employees and job-related themes focused on the company's commitment to its social responsibility, preserving jobs, creating a performance management system with sustainable goals, human rights, and training on gender equality, inclusion, and diversity. Concha and Toro reported only in 1 year employees' issues. GBS annual and sustainable reports including a statement of gratitude and towards its employees concerning their competitiveness. Grupo Bimbo stressed the success of the collective labor contract, the training, and the focus on leadership skills, development, and employee competitiveness. Grupo Bimbo was the only company of the 4 analyzed in this chapter that sent a message of condolences to the employees and families of victims of COVID in that year. Concluding remarks, critical findings. The purpose of the chapter was to answer the question as to whether the Latin American multinational employee-centered welfare approach changed as a result of the internationalization of the companies. The analysis identified a late entrance to the publishing of sustainability reports global movement. In addition, the employee-centered approach received few entries in the report's cover letter. This action might indicate one of the tensions perceived by the company. That is, there are so many issues related to sustainability that the ones associated with the welfare of the employees and related stakeholders receive little attention from the president of the board or CEOs. When one company When one compares the statements published over the years, one can observe how the companies describe their employee-centered practice using the language of sustainability and competitiveness. Although the cover letter means the company's actions related to the relationship with the GVC and the approach to the employees' welfare, one can assume that GVC parent company does not exert pressure to adopt such an approach. The companies analyzed in this chapter adopted the GRE or GC reporting frameworks. This action might indicate that there are elements in the environment that make these companies comply with those reporting frameworks or pressure to comply with the global social standards than other actors of the global value chain or with traditional welfare approach. Let me now pass the word to my colleague, Kalman Kalotai. Kalman, the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much, Annabella. Do you hear me? It's working perfectly. Okay, and can we have also the slideshow? Of course, now we have to jump to another continent. We will talk about Europe. The chapter that I will present has a co-author, Mr. Csaba Weiner. He has been also the co-author of this presentation that we have prepared. We are grateful, of course, to Gabor Turi for his research assistance and especially to Lourdes and Anna for editing our chapter and guiding our chapter. Next slide, please. The topic is the reaction of Russian business to the sanctions that were imposed after the attack on Ukraine, and then the reaction of Hungarian business in the Russian Federation to the changing environment. One thing that is important to keep in mind that the collection of information contained in the chapter was closed in August 2022. In this presentation, we have some updates. And I think that despite the fact that some months have passed since the closing of the chapter, the conclusions are still valid. Next slide. Why did we select Russia for the analysis? It's quite obvious that after the attack on Ukraine, Russia became the most sanctioned country on earth ahead of Iran and Syria. You have the most recent data from February 2023 about it. Next slide. Yes, the previous one. The first observation that we have made is that 13 of the 20 top Russian non-financial multinational enterprises are affected by the sanctions, which means that really Russian business is really hardly affected by the reaction of the international community. In the slide, you see in bold the companies that are affected, and in red bold, those that are state-owned companies. Of course, all state-owned companies are affected by the sanctions. Next slide. We try to monitor what reactions Russian companies have made. You have all the details on the slide. The gist is that practically all of them have adopted defensive strategies to minimize the losses, and mostly it resulted in reverse internationalization. Next slide. The result is very clear. It is on this slide. If you look at the January to September foreign direct investment outflows of the Russian Federation, these are the most recent data that are available. In year 2022, you see a massive minus $32 billion, a $32 billion divestment by the Russian firms, compared with the plus 38 billion during the previous year. And even to be seen here is that during the year of the COVID 2020, during the same period, there was a plus $2.3 billion FDI outflow from the Russian Federation. So the impact really has been massive on Russian firms. Why did we choose Hungary as a comparison and its firms? The main reason is that Hungary has a very special policy and a special place among EU and NATO members. The special policy is called the Eastern Opening to the East, an attempt by the government to increase business links with countries and with companies from the East, especially from Russia and China, with more or less mixed results. You should know that the Russian market is important for some Hungarian firms, We listed 3 of them, OTP Bank, Gideon Richter, which is a pharma firm, and MOL, which is an oil and gas firm. All 3 has been present in Russia for a long time and have had a relatively stable presence in the country. Next slide shows you the fact that indeed the strategies of Hungarian firms have been slightly different from what you observed from Western firms. In the case of Western firms, most of them divested from the Russian Federation or left Russia. Hungarian firms, according to this data, 60% of them stayed in the Russian Federation, and this percentage is higher only among the Chinese and Turkish firms, and more or less the same level as that of the Indian firms. Next slide. We also try to monitor what the impacts of sanctions are and how the Hungarian firms reacted. To sum it up very quickly, the most important effects were in the financial field, and they were also in the field of logistics and supply chains, logistics and supply chain disruptions. We also listed the other types of effects, like air travel restrictions or additional administrative burdens at the border that are not as important as the first 2. Next slide. The reaction of Hungarian firms mainly is that they try to hold their ground in the Russian market, but the challenges that they have to face may in the future become very big, and it's a big question mark whether they will remain in the Russian Federation if the war becomes really very long. And the last slide shows you some major differences between the 3 major groups, the 3 groups that we have monitored. Each of them have different approach. What is important to know that of the 3 groups, it's only in the pharmaceutical firm Gideon Richter, where the Russian Federation is the #1 foreign market. For the other 2 companies, other alternatives exist. And if you wish to, we can discuss that question of alternative markets. If companies lose the Russian market, what happens? If you could just show the last slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention. And now I give the floor to Kam Mongol Singh, who is PhD candidate at the Carnegie Mellon University. You have the floor. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Carmen. All right. My name is Cam Wilkinson, and my work that I'm presenting today is in collaboration with my advisor, Daniel Armanios at the University of Oxford. In our work, we're looking at the investment of multinational corporations in Thailand in the midst of the political turmoil that goes on. If you recall the most recent 2014 military coup. Thailand here is the empirical context, and it is an emerging market country that has experienced numerous coups. In its history, it has experienced 12 successful coups, which is defined as coups that had resulted in the overthrow of the current government, as well as 7 unsuccessful coup attempts. And despite that, Thailand has continued to experience significant economic growth, and foreign direct investment has played a key role in that for the economy. In our study, we look at the descriptive insights, and we try to understand the country's multinational landscape, how these multinational corporations invest in R&D and what are their tactics during the coup, and which sectors were these investments most likely to take place. On this slide, the main question of our study had been how the corporations had invested in R&D, and the data that we use have been an annual survey that's collected by the Thai government between the year 2011 to 2018 that were sent out to the firms that are operating in Thailand to ask about their R&D as well as innovation activity. And from our findings, we find that Japan is the most active source of multinational R&D in Thailand. The multinationals increase R&D after coups, even though it was at a lower rate than we saw for domestic firms. The increase that we see is largely attributed to the multinationals that are from G7 countries, with Japan being one of the first to act, as well as the one putting in the most investment. Multinationals, we see invest more in variable R&D spending than fixed. And that's both pre and post coup. By variable R&D, those refers to things like personnel and supplies. And by fixed, we mean larger investments into buildings and machineries. We also see that these MNCs increase R&D more in the high-tech sectors post-coup, and we find that the multinational countries that have more politically oriented business cultures in their home country tend to invest less in R&D post-coup in Thailand. In this presentation, I'll be focusing on these 3 bullet points in the results. As we see on the next slide, the R&D increase, if you could pull up the next slide. We see here on the left that by the red line that follows the dashed red line, which is the 2014 coup, we see that G7 countries are the ones that increase the average R&D spending in Thailand, whereas the green line, which is the emerging markets and other countries being the blue lines, did not see a significant increase. And on the right side, we see that Japan, signified by the green line, was the one that increased their R&D spending the most as compared to other G7 countries. And if we could go back one slide, Lourdes. Here we see that the main increase had been in variable R&D spending. We do see an initial jump in fixed spending by the red line on the left, but the continued increase had been in variable spending. And on the right, we see that the green line shows that most of the increase had been in high-tech industry. On the next slide, we look at the business culture in the home country of the multinationals that they come from. The graph on the left and the right use 2 different definitions for the politically oriented business culture. On the first one, we define this by the percentage of firms connected to government officials. And the second one is defined as the number of connected firms as a percent of market capitalization. We see that in both, the more highly connected they were in their home country, we see more of a decrease on a lower R&D spending post-coup. This suggests that politically oriented strategy might not be the most useful strategy as the host country is transitioning. And these political assets could actually be more of a liability in maintaining those connections and effects on their reputation. The main goal that this chapter does is we're trying to set an agenda for future research to explore the role of turmoil such as coups on multinationals. And from our findings, we need to better understand the tactics of companies amidst the political turmoil. While prior literature tend to argue that companies should avoid turmoil, this is not always possible. And here we suggest different ways that companies can navigate the political turmoil with strategies to de-risk the R&D investments, such as investing more in variable or in more high growth sectors. And also, we're trying to understand better how the home country of the multinationals' political environment may influence their operations in the target country. A lot of what's behind the strategic intention of the firms can actually be supplemented by more qualitative study that we plan to do in our next studies, and we hope we can supplement that even more. On our last slide, you can find my email as well as Daniel's email, and feel free to reach out to us about any questions you may have. And now I turn it over to Li-Min Chen.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ken. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present our latest study about the personal, organizational, and the national political connections. How about their different impacts on the cross-border acquisitions by Chinese listed firms? I think the cross-border. Oh, the first slide, please. Thank you, Nicholas. The first slide. Thank you. The title page. Thank you.
Please go ahead because we are. It's difficult to move the slides. Please go ahead because we don't have much time. Please move on.
I think the cross-border merger and acquisitions by Chinese listed firms is a part of the global value chain reinventing. So our study is related to this year's theme. In this slide, so our research question, we know that the political connections are common all over the world, in the United States, in China, and in any other countries. So our research question is, first, do different levels of political connections affect cross-border merger and acquisition performance differently? Here, by different level of political connections, we refer to personal political connections, organizational political connections, and national political connections. Personal political connections, we refer to the political status of the board members, such as the member, they are the top manager of the listed firms. They are also the members of the parliament, the Congress in China are 人大, the National People's Congress, and the 政协, the National People's Political Consultative Conference. And organizational political connections, we referred to the state ownership of the listed firm. And the national political connection. Last one, please. Thank you, Nicholas. Last one.
And the sound is not clear, so if you don't mind, maybe try without the because we can't hear you very well. Sorry, the sound is not good. So if you could maybe remove your headphones.
Yes, we are still in the slide of.
I can't hear you.
Research question. Last slide for research question. Thank you. The national political connections, we refer to the diplomatic affinity between two countries, the host country and China. We measured this by the voting consistency in the United Nations. And the research question 2. Furthermore, are there any interaction effects between personal and organizational political connections? And the third, secondly, are there any interaction effects between personal and the national political connections? Next slide. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you. This is our framework. We could see that our main effect is by the personal political connection, its influence on the cross-border merger and acquisition performance, as well as the organizational political connections and the national political connections feel direct effect. Besides, we'd like to investigate the interaction effects and the moderating effects by the organizational political connection and the national PC on the personal PC. Next slide. Our sample is for the cross-border merger and acquisitions by Chinese listed enterprises. we gathered 172 overseas merger and acquisitions. Some are for state-owned enterprises and some are private enterprises. We get the data from the China stock market and accounting research. We call it SESMA and the WIND database. And the voting data for the host country and China are from the United Nations Digital Library. Next slide, please. Our sample, see from our sample, there are more than one half listed firms have the personal political connections, but there are only 1/5 have the organizational political connections. Next slide. Most important, our findings are as follows. First, we find that personal political connections have the positive impact on the cross-border merger and acquisition performance, which means that the listed firms which have the more personal political connections will have the better cross-border merger and acquisition performance. Next slide, please. Second, the moderating effect of organizational political connection on the main effect is negative, which means that if we divide all the samples into two groups, then the group formed with organizational political connections. In this group, the main effect is very weak, is not so obvious. But in the group firms without organizational political connections, the personal political connections will be very important, and the main effect is very strong. Next slide. And third, the moderating effect of national political connection on the main effect is also negative, which means also if we divide our sample into two groups, then the group merger and acquisitions in countries with improved national diplomatic relations with China. In this group, the main effect is not so obvious, it's very weak. But in the group, the merger and acquisition in countries which with the deteriorated national diplomatic relations with China. In this group, the personal political connections is very important, and the main effect is very strong. And that's all for next slide, please. That's all for our presentation. Thank you for your listening. Thank you. I'd like to introduce our EMI fellow, Rui.
Thank you, Professor Chen, and thank you everyone for presenting today. It was really insightful, and we have some great questions for our panelists. So to kick off the questions, this is for anyone on the floor who wants to take it. Can companies take independent risks to ensure that their value chains are insulated from geopolitical risk or more insulated from geopolitical risk in the next years to come?
Maybe I jump in straight away on that one. I think, yeah, the answer is yes, certainly. There's an awful lot that companies can do to mitigate these risks. And I touched on it in the introduction. A lot of companies are putting together China Plus strategies or optionalization strategies, which are spreading that risk over a number of different countries. And that risk might be political risk, or it might be to do with natural disasters, for example. But we're certainly seeing a lot of business which was outsourced to China being moved to countries like Vietnam or Bangladesh. Now, there are several reasons for that, but one of those reasons is certainly to do with the tariffs which have been imposed by formerly the Trump administration, but also continued into the Biden administration. So certainly, yes, spreading the risk to a number of different countries, to a number of different markets is one way of mitigating that.
Wonderful, thank you. And then our next question actually has to do with multi-Latina companies. So multi-Latinas are not as international as other EMNCs, and they haven't been deemed as so far. And why is that? What can be done to change the situation?
Thank you. Perhaps I can say something about that. I think we have in Latin American countries a small group of already consolidated transnational firms. So this is a good news, and we have to expand the number of transnational enterprises with headquarters in our countries. I think when you see the biggest countries in the region, such as Mexico or Brazil or even Argentina, they have more subsidiaries out of the region. So it's not easy to understand that they have more scale, more power, more help from their governments. So I think one thing you need to expand these kind of activities or getting out the region is help, close help between public and private sectors. This is central in this kind of issues. And last, the finance. I think when you need to expand and to go abroad, you need finance. And this is not so easy in our region, and this is what I think we have to improve. Thank you.
And staying in the region a bit, to Annabella, this question might be appropriate for you, but is there enough of both consumer and employee sentiment in Latin America to force these companies to change their reporting practices for the better?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't get it.
Yeah, is there enough of both consumer and employee sentiment in Latin America to force these Latin American companies to change their reporting practices for the better?
Well, I think they already invested in the employee-centered welfare, and now they are moving away to adopt more competitiveness practices. Although they are continued training in basic education, to some employees, they are now focusing on leveraging their technical and digital skills to their employees. So perhaps they are not, they will continue investing in the social infrastructure they already built through the years, but they are moving away from that to make the employees more competitive internationally.
Got it. Thank you. And shifting a little bit over to India and China, in spite of their political differences and interesting relationship that they've had in the past, do you think India and China is there a future where we can see them doing business together?
I wonder, maybe I could answer the question, what is, in spite of the political differences, China invests in India, and the trade is still doing pretty well. So is a case, as we heard from Cam, is a case that in spite of the political turmoil, trade and investments continue, and we see Chinese brands at the top of the smartphones most used in India. Also, we see Alibaba investing in Paytm, one of the most important mobile payments applications. So we see this still thriving and continuing, a little bit on the line of what Cam and Daniel presented, investments and trade during political turmoil.
Perhaps if I can just jump in on that, I think it's interesting. I think a lot of the thrust of the Indian policy is about, I suppose, disengaging from their reliance on China and about developing their own ecosystem, manufacturing ecosystems especially in the high-tech sector as well. And we've seen it with Apple's investment in India recently. And a lot, Indian government has been building quite protectionist barriers in order to force global companies to establish Indian practices, which are going to be able to supply to create this manufacturing ecosystem, especially in electronics. So I think as we move forward, there will certainly be more self-determination, independence in that respect. But of course, as is most of the world is reliant on China, that is still the case.
Wonderful, thank you. And just our last question. So how do you think the prominence of geopolitics is going to stay the same or evolve in the next few years?
Well, maybe last point for me, definitely geopolitics is becoming far, far more important. We're seeing politicization of supply chains. As I mentioned, this is resulting in more protectionism, more fracturing, as the world, as Lourdes says, first up, is dividing between allies sourcing, friendshoring, however you might call it. It's a bifurcation of supply chains is occurring as these tensions increase throughout the world, and that's going to have big impacts. More diseconomies of scale, more costs as separate supply chains are being established. One for the West and its allies, one for China's sphere of influence.
Let me just add that, in fact, geopolitics has always been present in emerging markets. The difference is now that we see politics much more involved in business in Europe and US through industrial policies and direct scrutiny of government agencies to investments, not only from China, but from other countries. So the difference here is, again, emerging markets geopolitics was always important, less so. So the governments in France, UK, or Europe in general, and the US had been more hands-off business. And this is changing in a very rapid way with the last two governments in the US and also the European Union.
Thank you. And now I'll pass the word on to Anne Moreau to close off the webinar. So thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much, Ravi. This webinar concludes the series that we organized on the Emerging Market Multinational Report 2022. That, by the way, is the 7th report in our series, the EMI series on emerging market multinationals. I must say that during these two webinars, we have discussed quite a lot of issues, global value chain, of course, which was the theme this year, the impact of the sanction of Russia's, ESG, and also some specific issues related to Thailand and China. Now, two elements. First, 2 points. First, the topics of global value chain, the reconfiguration, the global reset, as John might have said in this chapter. I mean, this topic will be with us for quite a while, and we'll see the role of emerging markets, the role that they will play in it. So we hope that the discussion has opened a new horizons for research on the topic, because there is quite a lot to do. And I would say that the same can be said about ESG, which has been the subject of a number of presentations today and actually also last Friday. And this topic was the main theme of the Emerging Market Multinational Report. And this one will continue to be of great interest, I would say, for us, for academics, but also for a large audience, and especially as it relates to the emerging market perspective. We want to thank you very much for your contribution, you all the speakers today, Kalman, Annabella, Cam, John, Ricardo, Lin Min, and I hope I'm not forgetting anybody. And also we want also to thank our research team, Daniel Dos-Santos, who is our lead statistician, Sharjah Bank, who was in charge of the ESG ranking, a major milestone for the Institute. The organization with which we are cooperating, the OECD, our longtime partner, but also the IDB and the IFC. And again, our thanks to all those who have listened, and all the best to you for the future. And hope to see you again, because by the way, we are organizing regular seminars with Cornell, with a great partner actually in this exercise. Thanks a lot again.